Hello everybody, welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Donald as usual. Today we are going to field some of the questions from Curious Cat and from the Discord and just see where that takes us. So, Donald, take it away with the questions.
So the first two are from the Discord, and first up is Chill Guy Jahar. If you were caught for one of your many unspeakable crimes and put on trial, which Twitter lawyer would you want as your defense attorney?
Well, let's go through our options real quick. Off the top of my head, I can think of Allah Liker.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know even what kind of law he does, but I just, he comes to mind just like a Muslim, kind of. I feel like that's a good one to have in my court.
I would go with maybe Glenn Greenwald, if that counts.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, if we're going for people like that, then I'm going for the Dersh.
Oh, Dersh? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I figure, I hook him up with something and he'll get me out of anything.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And then Pennybags asks, I'd like to hear about how much guilt / a feeling of failure to live up to your own ideals plays a part in your religious experiences, if you haven't already talked about that at some point. So.
Okay, so that's obviously a part of anything where you're trying, like any kind of self-improvement thing that you're trying to do, I suppose. Like you have goals that you're trying to meet, and obviously you're not just immediately going to meet them like, the next day or something. So it's a process to get there. And I suppose dealing with the fact that you're struggling to get to that point is a pretty big part of that, right?
I guess for Catholics, I think people always kind of say it's, you're just guilty all the time. And there's always this like idea that, I think Chris Hitchens had this thing where he said that religions tend to set impossible goals and they make you feel bad for not living up to them. I feel like it's almost the opposite, the way that it works actually in reality, like the way that it's more kind of, you see yourself tending towards doing things that aren't optimal or something like that, right? It's almost, it's not that, it's that there is this sort of achievable level of effort and trying and doing well. And when you're doing it, you feel really good. That's sometimes, or like, at least it's it's a very positive experience to like actually meet your, to do something that benefits you through like the religious tendency or whatever, and then see the results as being positive and feeling unity with, just your spiritual life and that. And then when you don't live up to that, it's more kind of like, oh man, I don't know, I'm not feeling good kind of thing, So
yeah, definitely. I completely agree.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that because people really, really focus on this on a lot, like about shame and feeling bad about doing stuff that you wouldn't want to do otherwise, or some of that just kind of, it's like, I don't know. And I really think that's I think in those terms, it just obviously seems stupid then, right? Like it just, especially in our culture, the way that it is set up is that it's like you have these things that you want to do, and then the religion is screaming at you not to do them. And you just have to say, oh, they're being stupid for telling me not to do what I want to do. I'll just do what I want to do, and then I'll be happy. I think if it's set up in that way, then I think it's obvious that religion would seem stupid to you, because you would think, well, all it is this hectoring force that wants to ruin your life kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And yeah, I think I see that all the time with people who sort of dig into religion a lot, or especially on Catholics, like they seem to have that missing link there where they don't see that it's actually, a helpful thing or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the person asking the question, well, not the person asking the question, but the Christopher Hitchens quote is sort of criticizing like the worst possible manifestation of setting standards that religions do, But there's two sides to it. There's one side of like setting a higher standard than can really be expected of any person who isn't like perfect. Like in the Islamic perspective, we just look at prophets as the only people who really were able to totally be sinless. Like that's like everybody else has some measure of sin, and generally it's a lot of sin. you know. But on the other hand, like there's a lot of hadiths and sayings and stuff. Like there's one hadith where someone was really racked with these kinds of like this feeling of guilt and feeling like, you know, God's not going to accept him because of all his sins and stuff. And the prophet told him, if you people did not sin, God would destroy you and create people who did sin, because what God loves the most is when one of his sinful servants repents to him. So it's like the whole point of this isn't to avoid the sins and just to be perfect, because of like that's not the end goal. The real goal is that process and experience of repentance, so that you understand that like I'm not perfect and I'm trying to serve something like a greater good. And there's also like there's a hadith about the idea of every good deed is rewarded tenfold minimum, like it counts as 10 good deeds, and every like sin only counts as one, or it's just pardoned or forgiven. So and a good deed will wipe out a bad deed and all this kind of stuff. So I think of it more like there's sort of like a priority of things you should be doing. Like obviously you know, not everyone is going to be like a Mother Teresa kind of, you know, just spreading goodness all around the world in this kind of miraculous way or something, but you try to work on yourself to do what you can, and as long as you're trying like with a good effort, you should feel good about that and feel okay with the fact that you're not like perfect, because you're not supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you constantly hear in the Catholic tradition is kind of the joy of being Christian, or the joy of religious life kind of thing. Like it's not this idea that there are people who have experienced religious life in a positive way as just repentance to the point of crying all the time or something like that. That's fine, but the standard mode of the Christian life should be kind of like joy and, you know, overjoy at the experience. So it's almost like if you dwell on the pain in a negative way, that's not like release, then it's just that's a negative thing, because it traps you in that mode instead of, you know, realizing it. At some level, it kind of comes down to some of the stuff we've talked about before with violence and things, or kind of extreme behavior and stuff, is that there's some faith lacking if you're wallowing in negativity, because you don't realize that at some level that everything has already been ordained as it should by God or something like that, right? Like that's
Absolutely.
So I think that's part of it, is that if you give into this, yeah, like if you're trying to be aligned with God's will or something like that, then you're not going to be worried as much about just, dwelling on shame or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, in Islam, it's actually considered a sin to, or at least a sort of it shows that you have incomplete faith if you despair over God's mercy or something. If you think that your sins are too great for God, that's like almost an affront to God's mercy. Like, don't you believe that your Lord is good, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's like. That's considered like one of the devil's tricks, basically. It kind of takes you away from God. Like God wants you to come back to him with everything that you got. It doesn't really matter. Like what the point is that you sincerely are trying to be good, you know, and then that's all you got to worry about.
Yep. So next we have a question that is directed at me from the anonymous clowns of online, and that is that cartel podcast El Chapo gave 10 pieces of silver for Don, and he danced and he danced and he danced. My question, where is his dignity? So, you know, there's always things that you have to do in this life that you don't want to do. You know, do you think, you know, you see these people that do the Japanese commercials and stuff, right? Like where it's like the celebrities, that money, you know, maybe will at the end of the day become something that they could donate to charity or a good cause or something. You know, I don't know. There's always these things that you do on the side to make things work. So I don't think, you know, it's easy to shout from the sidelines, but, you know, when you're actually a celebrity, as I am, this is what, you know, this is what you have to deal with. So,
well, don't forget us little people, Donald.
Yeah. So now we have one directed at Tom. Is it true Muslim Tom is the infamous blonde sheikh and sends money to the Chechens and Bosniaks in their respective struggles?
I wish. They probably got more money than I do over there.
Yeah,
No,
sure.
but like yeah, I like the Chechens. They're cool. They fuck with the Russians all the time. I love reading stories like in the 19th century of like these Sufi groups and stuff that were like hanging out in the mountains, and there's all these like outlandish stories of like Russian soldiers coming in to try to like occupy the village, and like everyone's disappeared and they're like looking around and it's just a ghost town, and all of a sudden they appear from behind the rocks and one guy like takes out the whole squad and stuff. It's a lot of really
Yeah.
cool stuff like that. Apparently there was a guy, an Italian guy, who he was one of these, like these people who go to fight in like the Spanish Civil War, or people who've gone to Syria and fought on like for the Kurds or whatever, that kind of thing. There's an Italian who went to fight for the Chechens against the Russians during that period, and he kind of like pretended to be like this Sufi dude, like he had his own order and stuff, and he was apparently like a really good guerrilla fighter, and
Hmm.
like just kind of formed his own group on the basis of his like military successes and stuff. I forget his name. I think it was like Abdul Qadir or something like that.
That's cool though. Yeah.
Yeah, cool story.
Do you believe that it's hypocritical for the elites to claim that human beings are now morally superior than our ancestors while engaging in a transnational pedo slavery?
Human beings are like are more. What was the
Well,
question?
it's this idea. I mean, there's stuff like, okay, so do you believe that it's hypocritical for the elites to claim that human beings are now morally superior than our ancestors while engaging in transnational pedo slavery?
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah,
Are now more morally
yeah,
superior. I thought they were talking about like our ape ancestors or something.
yeah,
Uh,
no,
yeah, I do think that's a pretty big hypocrisy. Although I don't think it's just the elites that think that way. I think it's sort of part of the modern zeitgeist to think that like everything new is better, and it's going to get even better all the time, and that we're on some sort of like logic of reason, and that's necessarily good, and it all only
yeah,
produces good things and stuff.
yeah. I think that's true. I think that, yeah, I don't know. I think it's funny too because you see people say almost the opposite in a lot of ways that things are worse than ever.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
don't know. And I also think it's like one of those things where it really depends on what you're looking at, anyways. I feel like there's probably periods in human history where certain things are downplayed, like even in crimes or something that, I mean, like just, there might be more murder in certain area, but it's almost like Foucault in that way that like, you might have certain kinds of violence, but then other kinds of violence might be more minor or something, right? Like it's almost like there's these rolling tides of different types of immorality that like it's not like the overall level is that much different, but it's just it's expressed in different ways or it's noticed in different ways. Kind of like how in the United States where there's all this gun violence, but they only really focus on certain types of gun violence now is more kind of the thing that people worry about, like mass shootings and stuff.
hmm.
Even though that there's a lot of sort of in the background, just like say gang violence and stuff. So I don't know. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, there probably was similar things going on. That's just hard to find records of to really like
Yeah.
figure out to what extent that was happening. But then there's things like I was just looking the other day at Islamic hospitals in the 8th century, and they were just like open to everyone. They were obligated to treat everybody whether or not they paid. There was supposed to be no questions asked about payment. So even if you could afford to pay, if you just didn't, they were not supposed to push you on it. And it ended up becoming like a publicly funded thing through like religious endowments. And that's just
Hmm.
a, a clear example of like moral superiority in the 8th century that's under it's under like a religious rubric and everything. People tend to think of everything religious as being like backwards and like, oh, it's just like this kind of corrupt like power elite that controls things and they don't really care about this stuff. But things are a little more complicated than that. So like, there's pluses and minuses on both sides. And the other thing is like, I do think that there is something to the idea of people have gotten better over time, just generally speaking, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute that to some sort of like teleological progress thing. I think it's just like, humanity has matured to some extent over time, but that doesn't mean that we are necessarily even on the right track in a sort of broad way. Like
Yeah.
it could be true that we are off track and also have gotten better at certain things along the way as well, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the next question is, I've encountered this idea on the internet that we would eventually not have a system of law under socialism. No courts, lawyers, etc. Is this true or just another sort of internet socialism chatter? How was the legal system in the Soviet Union established? So we did talk about this a bit on a bonus episode early on, but I wanted to kind of get into, I don't know, like some of the other stuff that I thought was kind of interesting about this kind of thing is that, so there's two different things. There are people who actually think that there would be no system of laws in the future, or shouldn't, or even there's anarchists that believe that like there should be no system of, you should just not obey the current system of laws even. That's like a thing. Bob Black, who was kind of a troll in the anarchist community for years, had this thing where he would say that he would get angry at all the anarchists who were like, oh, it's just a true democracy. Anarchy is just true democracy. And he's like, no, no, no. Democracy is ruled by the people. I don't want to be ruled by people. I want to be ruled by myself or something like that, right? So there is that kind of trend. And I do think something is lost in the anarchist position, or say the far left Marxist kind of position of when you say, oh, no, no, we'll have government, we just won't have the state or something like that, right? Like, or, or some sleight of hand in between where they kind of go, well, we'll have things that kind of look like government, but they'll be self-organization. I don't know. I think there is something to just wild freedom, which should be respected and not transformed into this kind of organized thing. And if it's unrealistic, it's because it's supposed to be unrealistic in that way, right? Like it's supposed to be, if it's someone kind of saying, I am not going to obey by your rules, then, let's not be silly and say like, well, no, we'll just all agree what the rules are and then everything will be fine or something, right? Like, I don't know. I think there's something in between there. And so the Soviet Union did have this idea that eventually, the state would wither away and just become, and the idea was that it would just become so commonplace that there wouldn't really be need for, like, institutions still might exist to some extent, but there'd be no reason why you had to kind of enforce things through laws, because it would just be the way things are. Like it wouldn't even make sense to people to fight against them. So there wouldn't be like, Lenin said that there's these like copybooks, say in Russian schools, where you had to, in like the imperialist period kind of thing, where it was like you write out maxims about, thou shalt not kill and stuff like that. That's how a lot of the schools are operated, where you just kind of had to memorize things about what morality and stuff. The education system was not well developed in that way. And he said, in the future, it's not like we're just going to do those things. We're not going to just try to beat into people these ideas. We'll just do them because it's just natural or something like that. So it's kind of funny in that way, because he was saying, no, we agree with all those kind of biblical teachings and those narrow respects, just that people will believe them. So anyways, the point of that kind of pretext was just so in the Soviet Union, they did try to some extent to create things called like comrades courts. And it's this idea that the system would sort of defer to, it was almost like arbitration / jury of peers sort of thing, where they just took like random people sort of and let them solve, what was justice in a certain case or something. And it was for like small, like, sort of like petty things. And the idea was that it was sort of an example of society learning to govern itself instead of having to relate to these bureaucratic institutions, which seems shocking in retrospect, because you would think that everything in the Soviet Union was just top down and totally like a totalitarian thing, people always say, or even at least like super bureaucratic. And that's not really the case in some of this stuff, like this kind of thing. But I mean, it just ended up being a free for all and kind of corrupt and kind of like inconsistent across different cases, and just a lot of people trying to get each other into trouble and trying to, and people being vindictive and stuff. So it was very poorly set up. But I think stuff like that, like, I mean, most of the legal system really does operate in those ways. Like it operates in arbitration, it operates of people coming to mutual agreements and then the courts enforcing them. I think that's fine, but yeah, it is very the thing with from my basic kind of capsule overarching opinion on this kind of stuff is that there's no real reason to think it through too much because I don't. This is one of those things where it's such a radical change that the people who think that this is going to happen have the onus on them to change it. I think, like, you know what I mean? Like it's like anything else where it's like, say, getting rid of marriage or something, or getting rid of any other major social institution. The people who want to negate it, you know, it's not like they just can say it and then it's going to happen. They have to kind of put it into practice. And I think otherwise people have a right to be doubtful about that if it's not, put into place. So yeah.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of some of the stuff in Impossible State by Wael Hallaq, and we did a bonus episode on that book as well, but we didn't really get into this. He talks a little bit about the way that Sharia courts were set up, and they kind of were somewhat similar. I mean, obviously there are judges, and they're called qadis in the Islamic context, but they're sometimes different from the way that we think of judges. So they were almost like freelance professionals. Like you could go to different ones, and if you didn't like the ruling you got in one place, you could go to another. Now, obviously, that gets pretty complicated if you're trying to, if there's some conflict. But if you're just trying to find a solution to a personal issue or something, like a business thing you want to set up, and you're trying to find a way that works for you. Yeah, so it kind of worked in this way where everyone sort of had some understanding of the way that the law worked, according to like their general everyday needs. But then you would go to like a professional to sort things out in accordance with their expertise to that situation. Yeah, I don't. That's one of the parts of the book that I think is a little iffy, and he sort of overplays it. And I think that it was more often the case that these states would have their own official courts, and it wasn't just like this sort of like pseudo anarchistic kind of thing. But it's an interesting idea, and it's one, like you're saying, it's one of these things where it's such a radical shift in the terms of the law that it's hard to really get a sense of what that would look like in practice.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. I think any sort of more like semi-spontaneous, community-based alternatives to, outright coercion and stuff is interesting. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where I feel like it's an odd thing to organize a political movement around because it's more of hypothetical in some ways,
Yeah.
We'd have to come up with very specific proposals on how to change things in the short term, less than trying to just say, no, we just won't have this in the future or something. So,
It's
yeah.
one of those things that it seems like it would be useful in a situation that is pretty chaotic. Like if you're, I mean, I think this is probably one of the reason why in places like Afghanistan or Somalia, these kinds of groups tend to get a lot of traction pretty quickly, is because they can kind of rely on these sorts of cultural traditions where they have some sort of legitimacy on the basis of their reference to Sharia. And obviously it's not always a good thing, but I think there are examples where it has been totally like fine. Like, there have been Islamic movements like that where they've had a broad base of support, and they haven't needed to have like a state impose any kind of legal structures, because they can kind of develop them themselves and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. So the next question is, it seems like everyone has strong opinions on trade deals like NAFTA and TPP, but I don't understand either the deals or why people have strong views on them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good understanding of that stuff really. All I sort of get about it is that it's like free trade, and that what that essentially means is that it's deregulation and stuff like that. Like that's the main thing, is that it allows companies to do business and like pay attention less and less to things like labor laws and stuff like that. I don't know if that's accurate at all, but that's sort of, I imagine that's what most other people who have negative feelings about these things also are thinking.
Yeah, it is one of those things where economists tend to get pretty angry about this stuff for silly reasons because I mean like they get angry at the debate because a lot of what trade deals do is lock in things that are already sort of the case, and then the big debates within the program tend to be about, exposing new parts of the markets to trade deals. So it really is more kind of, it's almost like constitutions for trade. It's trying to impose these systems in a way that countries can't really break from the model that they're currently under. That's really the main thing, because people that do trade across countries want certainty. That's their main issue. They don't care about almost anything else other than trying to make sure that they put money into one country, they can take it out and put it somewhere else and not really be bound by any local laws other than just kind of very basic laws kind of thing. So, Noam Chomsky always hammers on this. He always says that like they're investor protection deals. They're not actually much to do with the flows themselves kind of thing. But I think people get angry about the economy in general, and then they point to the trade deals as the reason why they're angry. I think that's part of it. Like, I don't really think that the trade deals themselves usually have much to do with what people are concerned about, but I think people are rational about, it's sort of like how in the United States, like a lot of people are angry at the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times, so this is the thing. I always think to myself that like if I want to be really critical of what I'm thinking, that I should be able to point almost like a chain of memories in my mind of why I believe something specific about, like, say, trade deals. I have to think, what times in my life have I sat down and read about trade deals? What times, where am I getting this intuition from that I don't like them or something, right? Like, I feel like there's a lot of times where we just kind of feel like we know things. And you got to think that if you actually sat down and tried to prove why you do things, it's sort of like collections of emotions over time or something, right? Or like collections of information from here and there. Yeah, it's this idea that like, it's like you're just saying things that seem kind of true. But if someone was like really trying to hammer me and go, why don't you believe this or something like that, that would be it would be difficult for me to do. But I think so. My main thing on them tends to, that like, it just reinforces the inequality that we have between countries in a lot of ways, because if they can do things in in poorer countries where they just don't have the same environmental protections, things that would be crimes in Canada are standard operating practice in a lot of poor countries. Like stuff like being able to organize free unions and stuff just don't exist in a lot of places, and to some extent that and then there is that kind of race to the bottom thing.
Yeah.
I think all that kind of stuff make people kind of are right about the actual anger towards certain things within the trade deals tends to be confused. Like people think that they're doing things that they're not, I think, but that's just so true with anything with the economy that it's not really that. But anyways, the reason why is because when I did a economics degree, professional economists tend to really dig into this stuff as like proof that people don't understand what's going on. Like say Paul Krugman had this book called Pop Internationalism, which is a good book in some respects, that is just a collection of articles and stuff on trade deals and how politicians started to say things like competitiveness. That was like, it was one of those things like now people say disruption or something like that, different things like that. Like there's different jargon that gets thrown around. And he was proving in like detail that competitiveness between different countries doesn't exist. Like it's not a real concept. It's like a business jargon concept, which doesn't really make sense because it's not the way that economies operate. Like a certain country is not more competitive at something than someone else. It's one of those things that seems like it's true because there's competition between different businesses.
Right.
But countries don't operate that way. Like it's not like the country's there no matter what. It's just kind of there.
Yeah.
And it's not like the reason why things might locate this or that place has nothing to do with some overall idea of whether or not the country is competitive. So, but if you asked a lot of people about that who are sort of like centrist people or whatever, or, like different economists, or not even just economists, but like say popular politicians and stuff, especially in Canada, because we're a smaller country, they would obsess about competitiveness. They would like go on and on about we need these trade deals to stay competitive. We need these, even though it's like a zombie concept, it doesn't mean anything, but it determines almost everything that they do in some respects, like it's like, so I think that's crazy, but it's also like, it's a very strange thing about how these debates around trade operate kind of thing. So like, like these CEOs pour millions of dollars into these institutes that are like, how do we, I don't know, like say profit tax, corporate tax rates. So Trump reduced the corporate tax rates in the United States, I believe. And so Canada, there was a debate like, should we cut ours further so that we're lower than theirs or something, right? But there's so many things that go into a tax system in different countries, like from one country to the next, that it really doesn't, it's like so many things go into it that it has no real relevance. Like it's not really, and there's not even proof that that would actually benefit us relative to a whole bunch of other issues and stuff. So it's like, anyways, it's really, really funny to me in some respects, because it's scary how, like, if you watch like popular debates on CNN and stuff, it's like they only use the jargon. They never get to the underneath stuff about what actually is happening. They only talk about, like, we should have these rules in place that make us more competitive or something, which have nothing to do with anything. They're just, I don't know. It's very scary to me, but yeah, I don't know. So.
Does it make sense then to like oppose, like, say, the TPP? Like that was something a lot of people were up in arms against, and then they ended up scrapping it, which I have to imagine probably didn't have a lot to do with people's actual concerns and was more of an internal issue. But like, does it make sense to oppose something like that, or not?
Yeah, I think it does, in the way that if you look at them as investor protection deals, then it makes sense to oppose investor protections just as a general principle. Like, a lot of the times they're locking in bad things. Like that's the key of it, right? Like they're locking in, say, laws that you can't have certain environmental protections that are different in the United States, because it's like, because that is an unfair practice, because you're actually trying to benefit your own. So it's stuff like that. That's the theory that they kind of operate on, those kind of things. So I think it's important to oppose those deals. I am surprised at how much traction it has as an issue, though. Like, I think it's symbolic of people. It's like malaise at the overall economy in some respects. Like it's anger about how things operate, and acknowledging that it has a global context. I think that's part of it. But yeah, I think it's important to oppose the deals. But I also think that people have to be reasonable about saying, like, say in NAFTA in Canada, there is a problem sometimes that mainstream political parties will start to oppose these trade deals and then act as if that's the solution. Like it's the trade deal itself that's the problem. And then if you just kind of protect things more, you'll be fine. And that's not the case. It's just like in 1993, the Liberals won a majority in Canada after promising to scrap, the NAFTA, not sign it unless there was major changes made. And they just signed it anyways without any changes. So they were, they'd say jobs was their main thing. They said they would get in, and so, yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like anti-war stuff in the same kind of way, where if it's so focused on finishing the war, then it might not necessarily change anything about the rest of the security complex, kind of thing. So, yeah. So, anyways, that's would be my stuff on that. How do you guys maintain the concentration necessary to finish a book?
It's hard to answer that in terms of like how do you do it, because I don't know if it's not like you can do exercises or something to like do better at that or something. But like I've been saying, I tend to, these days I'm listening to audiobooks, and so that's pretty easy to maintain concentration for like an hour at a time while you're just like on a train. As far as, I wonder if they're talking in the short term, like just sitting down and reading, or if they're talking about like over the long term to actually finish the book.
Yeah, I think what they mean maybe is, yeah, I think maybe part of it is just this idea that it's so hard to pull yourself away from other stuff that, I don't know. Yeah, like that,
true.
kind of have to, how you set aside the time, how do you sit down and kind of just read something that's dry or something, I don't know, for a few hours instead of just doing anything else. I don't know. But yeah.
I find myself like these days I'm very disinterested in Twitter and stuff like that. Like it's the last thing I go to on
Oh
my
yeah.
phone. Like there'll be times when I am just, I'm at work or something and I have nothing to do, so I'm going through my phone. And it's like the last thing that I pull up to kill time. It's just not very interesting to me. And I find like that the effect that has on my attention span is really good. The fact that I'm not like always looking at what's on Twitter. I'm just more interested in like things that are a little bit more long form and a little bit, I don't know, just something I can like sink my teeth into a little bit more. So maybe taking breaks from social media is a good idea. It might also
Yeah.
be helpful to have like a routine time. Like I used to read before going to sleep, like for an hour or so, just in bed, like every night. I go through phases with reading, so that was kind of like my routine.
Hmm.
And that gets you through a book pretty quickly.
Yeah, for me, this used to be one of my main problems with almost anything was just that I couldn't focus on. It's not even like focus; it was more anxiety towards starting things or towards working on things at all. So I tend to go in phases where I read. I can just sit down in a few days and read a few books, kind of thing, or then I go maybe a month or two without reading anything really, other than just kind of online stuff and articles and things, but actually sitting down with some books and stuff. And so I haven't actually mastered it really yet. But yeah, I find that one of the main problems that I have with reading like this is that I don't know, there's something about knowing that I'm going to be different after I read it or something. It's just like
Hmm.
it's like a risk to me. It's like most of the time that this is the thing is that it's like with health and stuff. So a lot of the time I just feel tired and a little bit disoriented and like just I feel like it's hard to maintain. Like I feel like I only have so much energy to do actual thinking work kind of thing, right? Like actually, thinking through things and focusing on things. So I find it like say even just for getting back to people with emails about stuff I'm working on or something. So I find it hard because it will take me a few days to kind of gather my thoughts and put them together. But the main difference is, and this has been a really huge effect on my life, is that if I'm just chatting with people online, or if I'm just, reading the timeline on Twitter and stuff, that doesn't take me any energy at all. Not at
Yeah.
all. It doesn't, there's no anxiety about it. There's no, I'm just chatting with people, just reading their comments, whatever. Or Instagram is like that too, where I just can look through stuff, pictures and stuff. It's fine. So that was why when I was doing a lot worse, I used to be on forums and stuff all the time because that didn't take, it was just kind of like joking around. Like even when I'm writing a joke on Twitter, I mean, they're just sort of like half-assed jokes most of the time. So it's not like I'm actually sitting down and going like, this is a brilliant contribution to the discourse or something kind of thing. It's just kind of just goofy stuff. So I find that I can do that all day without even thinking about it. So I might actually even be laying down all the time while so it's like, it's almost like I'm a brain in a jar at that point kind of thing, just doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Or I might be on a train or I might be going to class or something, in the past and like so and then when I'm doing say stuff that I need to do around the house or something, right? I'll usually be listening to podcasts while I'm doing it as a way of keeping my mind occupied on something else other than anxiety and just, doing stuff around the house kind of stuff. So that's how I do that stuff all the time to kind of get that out of the way. And then, but to actually just sit there and focus on something that's just like, here's a block of text that you want to think hard about. It's like I don't know, it's like anxiety central kind of thing. So, yeah, so it's kind of funny, but so most of the time I feel like it's just I can't get into that mindset of just getting there where I need to. So, it's like everything else has to be going well for it to get to that point. So, which is funny because I also collect books. Like I've got like hundreds of books that just I want to read, and just and I do have like I have read probably like over the last I don't know like 5 or 6 years I have read like a few hundred books or something, but it's like it's just it's like I just almost all of those happen within like a week or two spans here and there kind of thing where I get into that mindset. So I always feel like if I could somehow bottle that and get it to the point where I'm actually burning through books instead of reading Twitter, that would be a very positive step, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it seems like that's like a framing issue,
Yeah.
because for me, I almost find reading to be that sort of like relaxing. I don't know if escapism is the right word, but it's like a free space. Like I don't have to worry about. I don't know. I don't approach books thinking like, okay, I have to take this super seriously. Like I sort of just let it do what it's gonna do. Like if it.
Yeah.
I guess I also don't like really. I just read what I'm interested in. Like I don't
Yeah.
kind of think of things as like, okay, this book is important. I should learn about it. Like if I don't naturally care to learn about that particular thing, then I don't really force it, and I think that makes it pretty easy to just read a book when I feel like it. But what tends to happen then is I go, like I said, in phases where I just don't read anything, and then I go through a phase where I'm interested in something and I start reading a bunch about it. And then I find like that's all I want to do is just read about that particular issue or read that book.
Yeah, and it's funny because I can kind of wrap my mind around that. It's just more kind of a almost I haven't been able to change my practice around that. That's I guess the main thing. Like I haven't been able to. I think it's. I mean, we talked about this before too. That it's kind of strange with having health problems in some respects, where when you talk about it a bit, it almost makes sense to just focus on that until you fixed it. But that's not actually how life works. So you kind of have to just muddle through and do what you're doing, and then figure if you can change it a bit here and there. But it does, especially when I first wasn't doing as well. Like it almost made sense for me. I was like, oh, I just focus on this entirely until things are better or something. And then it's like, no, that's not really how framing works or something like that, I guess. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think just to try to give this person some practical advice is if you are interested in reading something, just read it as much as you're interested in it. Like,
yeah,
like I even think it's beneficial. People are reading things like, like kind of like youth novels, like young adult novels, whatever they're called, and even like manga and comic books and stuff like that. I don't think that's a bad thing. Like it's just good to sort of process information that way, and that will help you with your attention span if that's the issue. And yeah, just read what you want to.
Sure. So, and then I've had a few questions about this next one. Can you guys cover co-ops, particularly consumer co-ops like the coops Club or perhaps the Quebec Solidarity Economy? I think it was Don who touched on the potential of direct consumer input when discussing the tailoring economic program. Okay. So, yeah, I do think co-ops are good. It's one of those things where I actually do think that I should try over time to shift over to co-ops more and more and just do small things where I can, just to not feed into the dominant sort of structures if I can. Like, even if it costs me a bit more or is a little bit more something, I think that would be positive for me. I think that part of the problem is that the kind of people that want to manage co-ops tend to be the kind of people who are not as interested in making a lot of money and not as interested in management theory as a thing because of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there is kind of an overlap. And what happens in most co-ops over time is that they grow into something that is professionally managed to the point where it quickly loses almost all of its positive relative benefits kind of thing, because it just becomes like another business then that just happens to have this strange corporate model kind of thing. Or like co-op housing, there is a really big push for people to look at housing as an asset that they can use for their retirement and things like that. And it's hard to break from that. I think and I think it's kind of reasonable for people to just kind of go with the flow on things, especially if it's not well developed as like an institution everywhere kind of things. And it's hard to so for co-ops, because there's so few of them, really, for housing, you have to sort of meet with the board and become a good member of that group kind of thing and be vouched for and stuff, or you have to be put in through waiting lists for social housing and stuff. And the waiting list for social housing is something like say a family, like say a mother with kids might have to wait 5 to 10 years or something to get into a place. It's just like, it's absurd kind of thing. Like people don't make those kind of plans for buying housing even. Someone's not going to say 10 years from now I'll buy a house or something. Like maybe if they're 19 or something, but it's just, it's already so designed to be punishing that it's hard to, anyways. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think another thing is that because the way that co-ops operate, there is this kind of hope that it could be totally autonomous from the state, but the state really, there's a book about this. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called like Retail Canada or something, which looks interesting. And what it's about is how early on there's actually a lot of co-ops doing a lot of the things around stuff like, say, furniture or different household goods. And I would say this is like maybe 20s or 30s. And there was Retail Nation, I think it might be. And it's there was this kind of culture bubbling up of all these different groups that were doing this. And then it got pushed out very, very deliberately by big retail organizations like Sears and all those different groups, which turned it into a very corporate system, which was dominated by, these big producers, big organization. And that was not a natural development. Like that was designed by those investors to basically profit off of squeezing out these cooperative groups and things. So there is this kind of possible alternative of federations of cooperatives, but I feel like there's got to be a political solution as part of that, because the state has to be able to culture that. It has to, without the state changing the way that financing works for businesses and all those kind of underlying things and structuring industries very deliberately around cooperatives, it won't happen. It just won't happen otherwise, because the institutional power of big business is just so powerful that it's very, very hard for, say, local projects to be able to change that. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't really have much to add to that.
Okay. Yeah. I've made a lot of, okay, this is the next question. Sorry. I've made a lot of real world friends. How do I go about making friends? And we've had this question a few times. How would you suggest?
Well, we've sort of talked a little bit about just it's a pretty low barrier to entry in terms of like interacting with other people. So I think one thing that really it puts me off, and I think it puts a lot of people off, is like people trying too hard. You know what I mean? Like those, like the reply guy type of thing, where it's like you're just forcing an interaction or something. Like you don't want to like force it, but if you think someone is, I don't know, you think someone's cool or whatever, you want to be friends with them. I assume you would have something to say, or whatever that reason is. You think they're funny, you have the same sense of humor, you have the same sorts of ideas about things or whatever. You just start talking about it. I don't know. I don't have like it's sort of hard for me to imagine this as a problem, I guess. So I don't know how useful that advice is really.
I think part of the advice would be, for me, it would be that most people online, the way that it seems to work is that it's sort of hard to pick out who people are from sort of a general overall mass of just large numbers of people interacting and stuff.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to keep track of who is who and what they're about, unless they're very quite distinct. But otherwise, most people kind of fall into a gray area where you sort of go, oh, that's that guy who, and then you kind of remember a few things about them or something. But it's not like, that's just like most people that you interact with anyways. But the trick, I think, is that there has to be some reason why you are talking more that is, somewhat contrived or something like that. Like it's got to be, you won't become friends just by accident kind of thing in the way, I mean, unless you would have anyways. But I would say like try to get into chats with people, like DMs or something like that, with people that I would say worry less about like individuals and more about finding like Amelia that you actually are interested in and kind of want to meet people from that milieu.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And try to find ways that people are talking get into situations where they're talking casually about the sort of things you're interested in, but not just kind of like a forced one-on-one situation as much, but just kind of people going back and forth. And then once you're in that situation, you can kind of then focus more on, hey, let's talk about this specifically one-on-one and stuff. So
yeah, and also you should join our Discord, because there's a lot of nice, friendly people in there.
yeah. So the next question is, what are some of the stricter aspects of your religions you find difficult, and how do you reconcile them with your own lives?
I think, just in sort of a general sense, I think one of the most difficult things about Islam is the fact that just the past 100, 200 years have really disrupted the way things worked. Like for over 1,000 years, things were sort of structured at the social level around the religion, and especially the Sharia and all that kind of stuff. So the idea that you would follow certain things was just built into society. Things like even just halal food, or the way that you would get married and arrange a relationship and all that kind of stuff, that was just sort of all done in a kind of unified way according to what the religion, the understanding of the religion. And nowadays that's not the case, and it makes it very difficult to sort of live like this double life of being like like a typical modern person, and then also trying to live according to Islam, but then also sort of trying to interpret what Islam wants of you from these rulings that are in a completely different context. They're from like an agrarian medieval society and stuff. So how much of these things are based on timeless things that you should just strictly follow regardless of your context, which is very little, frankly. But it's really hard to draw that line and to figure out what exactly is the right thing to be doing at any given time. So just in a general sense, I think that's that's basically the big issue. And the thing that comes up the most often is stuff like marriage and relationships. It's just done in a very different way. Like it just, there isn't the kind of social structure to support what would be like an Islamically appropriate way to find a a marriage partner or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And economically, like talking about like halal income, halal food is difficult because it's hard to. I just don't trust a lot of like halal certified stuff that's mass produced to be actually done in a way that's like sincerely in accordance with like the ideas behind taking care of animals properly and having them being treated well, and then the meat being dealt with in a clean way and all that kind of stuff.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, that you thought you don't trust the labels. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not. Some of these places, it's just like they have a speaker in a warehouse that just says Bismillah, 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 Bismillah. So that's, and then everything else is just a factory farm. Like, so that's the only thing that makes it whole. Like, that's ridiculous, So as far as that goes, like you would want to find like a family farm where you can kind of figure out that, okay, these people are sincere and they're trying to do the right thing, but that's very inconvenient. It's generally more costly, so that becomes a problem. And like clothing, like you can't find halal clothing. You can't find clothing that's not made by some like child slave in Indonesia or something. You know what I mean? Like that's just not a real option. You can go get artisanal stuff, but again, it just becomes like a huge cost burden. So all that kind of stuff is pretty difficult to deal with. But as far as like just practicing, I would say that all of the issues around that for me are just my own problems. Like if I'm not praying or whatever, that's not because of some kind of like social obstacle or something. That's just me. It's a little bit different for women, I think, but yeah, for me personally, that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I think for me, there's two things I would say that I sort of think about a lot that are stricter in what I'm supposed to be doing than what I am doing, kind of. One of them would be the sort of like public activity of the church, where Catholicism is supposed to be where you're participating in like a public prayer, basically, by going to mass and taking communion and things like that, and being involved in different groups and stuff like that side of thing. Is I find it like I've gotten to the point where I rationally accept it at some level, and I know that I should be doing that kind of thing, but because of just like anxiety about taking on a public role and actually kind of changing from just being someone that has these kind of opinions to being someone that is sort of out and about doing this kind of stuff, I find that a hard bridge to, like I've only been to mass one time in the past year, basically. So it's just kind of, I'm supposed to be going every week, basically. So that's hard for me to get to the point where I'm, just totally integrated into a community other than just kind of thinking about it and stuff. And then the other side of it, but I always kind of feel like I'll get there someday, so I don't worry about it as much. And it's kind of funny because I would say that is like sometimes people will message me just encouraging me about different things about religion or ask me questions. And if they're people that are very involved in the church in different ways, they tend not to be worried about my opinions on most things. They're very worried about me not going to church. It's kind of funny that way. Like people will message me and say like, you need to be going to mass and all that kind of stuff, right? So I would say that is one of the ones I experience more openly. And then that sort of related, like second one too, is like the stricter aspects that actually sort of I think about a lot, which is less affects my behavior maybe, but it's more out there. It's kind of, it's just the everything around sexual morality in the church is completely different than in sort of the popular dominant, like what the hierarchy believes, is so different than from what mainstream society believes that it constantly comes up. Like it constantly comes up in people talking about things online or debating things and stuff. And I kind of inherited from just, for years, just the standard kind of left wing views on all those things. And the thing that surprised me the most is that not that I've changed my mind on a lot of things, because I haven't really changed my mind on a lot of the issues, like really on like say, like I haven't flipped on most of them kind of thing, right? But like I would say that the most surprising thing that has actually been hard to struggle with is that I've started to see where people are coming from with more traditional views on these things. Like more and more I understand what they're saying, and I understand why the common arguments against it don't tend to work. And that's been really shocking to me, and kind of it's hard to deal with because, I don't want to shame people or get angry at people or whatever when I read about, like, say, gay relationships or something like that, like you read a lot about, yeah, I don't know how to put it, but just that you start to understand where the teachings are coming from,
Yeah.
and you
I know
don't
what
want
you
to,
mean.
yeah, and you don't want to be like turn it into like an animus and get like, but you also don't want to just dismiss it out of hand. If you do, if I disagree with it, but I want to think it through, then and respect the people that are making these critical arguments. Yeah, so that's hard to do. I think that's hard to do in a way that's respectful and it's not just kind of combative, I guess would be the thing. So yeah.
I can relate to a lot of what you're saying there. I found though that the people who like the imams and scholars and stuff like that, they tend to be the most open-minded about these things, and they're obviously the more knowledgeable in comparison to like to the average Joe or Mo, I guess.
Yeah.
And so like because they're aware of like the long tradition around a lot of these issues and the discussions that have been going on, they don't get so caught up in like it's only this way and that's the anything else is like a very evil thing. So I tend to find that it's like common people who have particular opinions that they back up with the Islamic tradition. Those are the people that are the real like absolutists. It's not really like the so-called clergy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's. Do you think that's the case with the Catholics too, or no?
I think it's complex. So for something like pro-life stuff in the United States, the hierarchy is very, very strongly pro-life and really takes like a leadership on that, a lot of things. But
Mm.
and it's always, I mean, it predates the sort of pro like evangelical kind of thing. Like that was just like a traditional Catholic thing for years before it became a right-wing cause kind of
Yeah.
thing in some respects. But I do think there's a very important interrelationship between the evangelical right-wing think tank kind of stuff, like astroturf kind of things, and the way that traditional beliefs are portrayed and promoted kind of thing. Like I feel like the arguments tend to be imported a lot of the time from the mainstream Republican discourse. And that's harmful, I think, because it ends up a lot of the time being a political club, and then it's not really. Yeah, and I think there's parts of the hierarchy that are open to change on that kind of thing, but like what I mean, like it's hard because there are obviously many, many conservative priests who just openly disdain a lot of this kind of stuff. But I do think that there is something to at least true about what you're saying, about this idea that if you're, yeah, like, the Pope said, they asked him early on, I guess, what would he say to a gay parishioner if whatever. And then he was like, who am I to judge
Mm.
kind of thing, right? Like he was like, it's not really, it's like, that's not, but, he's still, at the end of the day, if you asked him his specific views about it, he would still be honest and say like, oh, I think it's disordered and it's not in tune with nature in the religious sense and all that kind of stuff. Like he would still have that same opinion. But I do feel like there is this kind of, in any sort of hierarchy like that, there's a tendency to kind of have the party line. And then I think that party line can change over time or be interpreted differently and stuff. And I don't know. And I also feel like as individuals, we just are forced to decide for ourselves what we think is true. It's just we can't escape from debating it ourselves. Like we have to think it through. So yeah.
Sure.
Although the next questioner might disagree because they've left a comment for us, which is all we need is Khilafat. Khilafat is all we need. Is that how you say that?
Khilafah, or the Khilafat. Yeah. So that's the caliphate.
Yeah.
The famous caliphate. Yeah. So, okay. Again, like we talked about that sort of thinking at length on our bonus episode about the impossible state. And anyone who's interested in the idea of an Islamic state and like what that looked like historically and what that might look like in a more reasonable manifestation than, say, like ISIS or something, should check that book out. I think it's a pretty good read. I do have my reservations about some of the claims that it makes. I think it's fairly polemical, but I think it does a good job of like kind of pushing back against both the people who kind of take this view that like theocracy is just inherently evil or something, or that like even that an Islamic state is a theocracy. In fact, what he argues in the book is that there's no such thing as an Islamic state. And it also sort of pushes back against ideas on in Muslim discourse around the idea of like, oh, well, we just take the modern state and install Sharia, problem solved, kind of a thing. Yeah, I mean, I guess that comment wasn't really asking a serious question or anything, but
no, but it's funny because that book has come up a lot since we've even talked about it, and it makes me want to read it because I think it's interesting how we do have a very interesting view of like theocracy or something like that as just it's basically like everything we imagine about the government now except plus religion kind of thing, instead of something that might be different. So I would I might check that out too. So well, that was the questions that we had lined up for this week. So
okay, cool. That was some good stuff.
Yep.
All right, thanks for listening, guys. If you want to send us some questions, you can find our Curious Cat at the Twitter. It's at YouCan'tWinPod. There's a link pinned there. If you are subscribed to the Patreon, you can join up with the Discord, and you can send in questions there, as well as join our little burgeoning community there. It's cool now. It's a lot more active than it used to be. People are kind of chatting in there. It's like a little group chat. It's a good time.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye. See you next week.
Nigga disappear like hocus pocus. Gotta stay focused. From the bullshit. Tryna stay vibrant. Off a 4-0 bullet on some motion. And some boot up drink and some go shit. I'm tryna lean about 2 with the boot bit. I started off like you with the boot kit. Build a baby boot, tolerance the boot bit. Working with the work bit. Know you finna too quick. I know you finna gonna do shit. You a snitch, bitch, you ain't in finna do shit. From the 4-0s and some more shit. I'm tryna stay focused. From the bullshit. You gotta stay focused. From the ones that's the closest. I'm tryna stay focused. Gotta keep the shit in motion. It come from every angle. From the ones who that's the closest. They try to fucking taint you. Try to throw you in some bullshit. Tryna keep my head above water. That's why I try to stay walking on water. I ain't tryna be waiting in the water. And when you're waiting, then you're waiting in the water. Too long to be waiting in some water. I got more shit to do and I got orders. I got more shit to move and boost borders. I got more shit to move it to borders. Gotta stay focused. From the 4-0s and some more shit.